The vibrant hum of laughter and the cheerful chaos of balloons filled the backyard as the celebration for her grandson's 8th birthday was in full swing. Family and friends crowded together under the warm, late summer sun, exchanging smiles, gifts, and the occasional playful jest. It was the kind of scene that made her heart swell, a rare moment when everyone she loved seemed to be in the same place at once. As the grandmother watched her grandson blow out the candles on his dinosaur-themed cake, her thoughts drifted, carried by the bittersweet melodies of nostalgia. She thought about her own childhood birthdays, simple affairs with homemade cakes, neighborhood kids, and a mother who always sang slightly off-key but with unmatched warmth. Just as her memories began to settle, the sound of the garden gate creaking open jolted her back to the present. A man stepped in, dressed simply, but with an air of confidence that caught everyone's attention. His age was hard to place, perhaps mid-50s, though his sharp eyes held a depth that suggested he had lived lifetimes. There was something odd about him. He wasn't part of the family, and nobody seemed to recognize him. He didn't carry a gift or offer the usual pleasantries. Instead, he scanned the crowd as though searching for someone. She studied him from her chair on the patio, where she had been watching over the festivities like the matriarch she was. A flicker of recognition passed through her, but it was faint, elusive, like the fleeting scent of a flower you can't quite identify. The stranger's gaze eventually landed on her, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire party paused. Their eyes locked, and she saw something in his expression, curiosity, perhaps even sadness. It was unnerving, yet oddly familiar. Her daughter broke the tension by asking if anyone knew who he was, but the stranger only offered a polite smile and introduced himself as Daniel. He said he was passing through the neighborhood and heard the sounds of a party, prompting him to step in and see if it was someone he knew. The explanation was strange but not entirely unbelievable, though it did little to soothe the unease growing in her chest. As the party continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel's presence wasn't mere coincidence. He lingered at the edges of the gathering, engaging with guests but always keeping her within his peripheral vision. When he finally approached her, she felt her pulse quicken, not out of fear but anticipation. "You have a lovely family," he said, his voice steady and warm. "It's clear they adore you." She thanked him, choosing her words carefully. His compliment felt genuine, but his presence still felt like a puzzle, missing too many pieces. Throughout the day, snippets of conversation revealed fragments about Daniel. He was well-traveled, spoke about places she hadn't heard of in years, and mentioned details about events that eerily mirrored her own past. Every anecdote felt like a breadcrumb, leading her closer to a revelation she wasn't sure she was ready for. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, she found herself alone with him near the garden fence. "You seem familiar," she finally admitted, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Have we met before?" His eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability behind his confident demeanor. "Not exactly," he said cryptically, "but we share more than you might think." The answer left her with more questions than clarity. She didn't know then that the encounter would spark a journey into her past, unraveling secrets she thought had been buried forever. The stranger at her grandson's birthday party wasn't just an uninvited guest. He was a harbinger of truths that would change her life forever. As the party began to wind down, with children chasing the last bursts of energy and adults sinking into the comfort of slower conversations, the grandmother found herself seated on the patio, still mulling over her brief exchange with Daniel. Something about his presence lingered, like the aftertaste of a strong, unfamiliar tea. He moved among the guests with a natural ease, drawing laughter here and there, but his watchful eyes seemed always to return to her. She couldn't tell if it was curiosity or something deeper, something that felt like longing. For a woman who prided herself on intuition, she found her inability to place him both frustrating and unsettling. It wasn't long before Daniel approached her again, this time holding a glass of lemonade he had poured for himself. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. She hesitated for the briefest of moments before nodding. "Of course," she said, offering a polite smile. He settled in, his movements measured and deliberate, like someone accustomed to earning trust rather than assuming it. "You've built quite the legacy here," he said, nodding toward the crowd. "It's clear your family means everything to you." His words struck a chord. She wasn't used to strangers making such observations, especially ones that felt so pointed. "Family is what keeps us grounded," she replied, her voice steady but cautious. "It's what reminds us of who we are." Daniel gave a small, thoughtful nod, his eyes scanning the yard as if he were absorbing her words. "But sometimes," he said quietly, "family is what helps us find who we've lost." The statement hung in the air between them, heavy and charged with meaning. She glanced at him sharply, searching his face for any sign of hidden intent, but he remained composed, his expression unreadable. "You speak as though you've experienced loss," she ventured, her curiosity overriding her hesitance. He smiled faintly, a bittersweet curve of his lips. "Haven't we all?" he said, deflecting without entirely dismissing her question. The conversation shifted, meandering through safe, surface-level topics: the weather, the joy of grandchildren, the unpredictable chaos of family gatherings. Yet, every so often, Daniel would say something that felt oddly personal, as though he were testing the waters of her memory. He mentioned a small town where he had once lived, a place she hadn't thought about in decades. He spoke of a community center that used to host summer dances, the details so specific it sent a shiver down her spine. "I used to go to those dances," she said cautiously, her voice laced with suspicion. "My best friend and I would spend hours getting ready, only to sit by the punch bowl half the night." Daniel's eyes lit up at her admission, though he masked his reaction quickly. "Those were simpler times," he said, his tone wistful. "And sometimes the smallest details stick with us, don't they?" She nodded slowly, her mind racing. Who was this man, and why did he seem to know so much about her past? She wanted to ask him directly to demand answers, but a part of her hesitated. There was a vulnerability in his demeanor, a quiet sadness that suggested he wasn't here to harm or disrupt. He was here for a reason, and she needed to tread carefully to uncover it. As the evening wore on, the guests began to trickle out, their goodbyes mingling with the laughter of children reluctant to leave. Her daughter approached, thanking her for hosting and offering to help clean up, but the grandmother waved her off. "Go home," she said gently. "I'll handle the rest." Her daughter hesitated, glancing at Daniel with a raised eyebrow, but she didn't press the matter. "Call me if you need anything," she said, giving her mother a kiss on the cheek before gathering her family. With the yard now nearly empty, save for a few lingering balloons and scattered plates, Daniel remained seated beside her. The silence between them was both comfortable and charged, like the calm before a storm. Finally, she turned to him, her patience wearing thin. "You've been circling around something all day," she said, her tone firmer than before. "If you have something to say, now's the time." Daniel met her gaze, his expression soft but resolute. "You're right," he admitted. "I came here for a reason, but I wasn't sure how to approach it. I didn't want to disrupt your day, especially one so important to your family." She studied him, her heart pounding in anticipation. "Disrupt it with what?" she pressed. His answer was a simple yet disarming question. "Do you believe in fate?" The question caught her off guard, and she couldn't hide her surprise. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "I've always believed we make our own choices, but sometimes things happen that feel like they're meant to." He nodded, as though her answer confirmed something for him. "I feel the same way," he said, "and I think fate brought me here today, too." Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, placing it gently on the table between them. It was a locket, tarnished with age but unmistakably familiar. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, her mind racing back to a time long ago, to memories she thought she had left behind. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel's answer was as simple as it was devastating. "It belonged to my mother," he said softly, "and she always told me it would lead me to you." Her hand trembled as it hovered over the locket, the cool evening air doing little to steady her nerves. She hesitated to pick it up, almost afraid of what touching it might unlock within her. Memories, emotions, truths, things she wasn't sure she wanted to confront. The intricate detailing on the locket's surface was unmistakable, a design she had traced with her fingers countless times in her youth. It was hers, or at least it had been. The locket had disappeared from her life so many years ago that she had almost convinced herself it no longer existed. Yet here it was, placed before her by a man she barely knew, claiming it as part of his family's legacy. How did your mother come to have this?" she asked, her voice thin and barely audible. Daniel leaned back slightly, his posture still calm but his eyes betraying a storm of emotions. "She told me it was a gift," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper, regret perhaps or longing. "A gift from someone who meant the world to her. Someone who changed the course of her life." The grandmother swallowed hard, her mind racing to connect the pieces of the puzzle. Her past felt like a distant, half-forgotten melody, but this locket was a sharp, jarring note that pulled everything into sharper focus. She had given it away once, impulsively and with all the weight of youthful love. The memory rushed back to her, standing by a riverside on a warm spring evening, her heart pounding as she pressed the locket into the hands of a young woman who had tears streaming down her face. "Take it," she had said back then. "It's a promise. No matter what happens, you'll always have this to remember me by." The young woman had been her best friend, but their bond had been more complicated than simple friendship. It had been layered with secrets, forbidden emotions, and the unbearable weight of societal judgment. The locket was meant to be a token of solidarity, of loyalty in the face of a world that would never understand. But life had pulled them apart, and she had buried the memory as deeply as she could, too afraid of the repercussions of revisiting it. Now, decades later, the locket, and the past it represented, had resurfaced in the hands of a man claiming to be connected to her through fate. "I need to know the truth," Daniel said, his voice breaking through her spiraling thoughts. "She never told me much, but what she did say has haunted me my whole life. She said you were the one person who truly knew her. She said you were the reason I exist." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. "What are you saying?" she managed, though her mind had already begun to piece together the implications. Daniel's eyes softened, his expression a mix of hope and trepidation. "She was my mother," he said simply, "and she always told me that you were her greatest love." The world seemed to tilt beneath her. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening, as memories she had long suppressed surged forward. The young woman by the riverside, her name was Evelyn. They had grown up together in a small, conservative town where deviation from the norm was neither tolerated nor forgiven. Their connection had always been more profound than anyone else could understand, but it was also doomed to secrecy. Evelyn had been sent away suddenly, her absence explained with half-truths and hurried excuses. The grandmother had never seen her again and had never dared to search, fearing the repercussions for both of them. "You're lying," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "This can't be true." Daniel shook his head, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm not lying," he said gently, "and I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to understand. I want to know who she really was, and I want to know why she always spoke of you as though you were the only person who ever truly saw her." Tears welled in her eyes, the weight of decades of silence and regret crashing over her. "I didn't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know she had a child. I didn't know she broke off, unable to finish the thought. Why now? She demanded after a moment, anger bubbling up to mask her pain. Why come here today? Why not sooner? Daniel sighed, his gaze dropping to the locket on the table. She passed away 6 months ago, he said softly. She left me this locket and a letter. The letter didn't say much, just that if I wanted to find out the truth about her, I should find you. She didn't even leave your name, just enough details for me to figure out where to start. The revelation left her reeling. Evelyn was gone. The thought was unbearable, a wound she hadn't realized she still carried, now ripped open anew. But what cut deeper was the knowledge that Evelyn had kept her in her heart all these years, even as life had taken them in different directions. She deserved so much more, the grandmother said finally, her voice a broken whisper. She deserved a life without fear, without judgment. I wish I could have given her that. Daniel reached across the table, his hand hovering just above hers before he pulled back, as though uncertain of the boundaries between them. You gave her more than you realize, he said. She told me once that the happiest moments of her life were with you. I think that's why she held on to this locket. It was her way of keeping those moments alive. She couldn't hold back her tears any longer. They fell freely, tracing lines down her weathered cheeks as she mourned not just for Evelyn, but for the life they might have had if the world had been kinder. Yet, beneath the sorrow, there was also a flicker of something else, hope. Evelyn had sent Daniel to her for a reason, and while the past could not be changed, perhaps the future still held possibilities. The locket sat between them like a physical manifestation of a bridge spanning decades of silence and unspoken truths. The grandmother's hands remained clenched in her lap, the urge to reach for it tempered by a deeper fear. What would reclaiming it mean? Could she truly face what it symbolized? Daniel, still seated across from her, seemed to sense the weight of her internal struggle. His gaze shifted from her tear-streaked face to the quiet yard around them, now empty to the day's earlier laughter and energy. The quiet was oppressive, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling inside her heart. Does anyone else know you're here? She asked finally, her voice wavering but determined. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. I didn't think it would be right to involve anyone else. This is between you and me. Or at least it started that way. His words carried an unspoken implication that more was at stake than just the two of them, and she didn't miss it. Her family. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her. What would they think if they knew? Could they understand? Would they condemn her for choices made in a time and place so far removed from their own experiences? She had spent her entire adult life cultivating an image of stability and traditional values, the foundation upon which her children and grandchildren had built their lives. This revelation threatened to upend everything. Why now? She asked again, though this time the question wasn't accusatory. It was a plea for understanding. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table as his voice dropped to a softer tone. Because I've spent my whole life wondering who she was, he admitted. I knew my mother loved me. She showed me that every day. But there was always a sadness about her, something she never talked about. When she gave me the locket and told me to find you, I realized that whatever it was, it had to do with you. I think she wanted me to know the truth. And I think she wanted you to know it too. The weight of his words settled over her, and she pressed her hands to her temples as if trying to physically hold herself together. The truth. It was such a simple concept, but the reality of exposing it felt monumental. It's not that simple, she said, her voice breaking. There are people here, people I love, who might not understand. I don't even know if I understand. Daniel's expression softened, and he nodded as though he had anticipated her response. I'm not here to force anything, he said gently. But I think it's important to remember that love and truth aren't always easy, especially in families. Sometimes they're messy, complicated, even painful. but that doesn't make them any less real. His words struck a chord, but they also reignited her anxiety. She had spent her life carefully constructing the ties that bound her family together, hosting holidays, mediating disputes, ensuring that her children and grandchildren always felt safe and supported. This revelation, however well-intentioned, threatened to unravel those ties. She couldn't help but wonder, would they see her differently if they knew? Would they respect her less? Or worse, would they feel betrayed? "What about your family?" she asked, deflecting slightly but also genuinely curious. "Do they know about this, about me?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he admitted. "I wanted to understand it all myself before I involved anyone else. But I'll tell them eventually. They deserve to know, just like I think your family deserves to know." Her heart sank at the thought. The idea of sharing this with her children, of risking their judgment or disappointment, felt unbearable. But Daniel's calm conviction planted a seed of doubt in her fears. "Do you think they would forgive me?" she asked quietly, surprising herself with the question. It was as much about Evelyn as it was about her. Would her family forgive her for a past she had never shared? For the parts of herself she had buried out of necessity, out of fear? Daniel considered her question carefully before answering. "I think forgiveness is a journey," he said, "and sometimes it starts with forgiving yourself. My mother always spoke about the strength it took to love someone when the world was against you. She admired you for that, even though she never said it outright. If you can show your family that same strength, I think they'll understand. It might take time, but I believe they'll see that love is never something to be ashamed of." His words brought tears to her eyes again, but this time they were tears of something closer to relief than sorrow. She had spent so long hiding, afraid of the judgment that might come if her past were revealed. But what if Daniel was right? What if her family, the people she had spent her life building and nurturing, could find it in their hearts to accept the truth? She looked at him, this man who was at once a stranger and a connection to one of the most profound relationships of her life. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to spill over. Daniel reached for the locket again, his fingers brushing its surface with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "I just want to know the person my mother loved. And I think, deep down, you want to know me, too." The simplicity of his request broke down some of the barriers she had built within herself. He wasn't asking for a grand gesture or a public revelation, at least, not yet. He was asking for a connection, for a chance to bridge the gap between their lives and create something meaningful out of the pain and loss that had brought them here. "I don't know if I can give you everything you're looking for," she said honestly, "but I can try." It was a small step, but it felt monumental. As the weight of the moment settled over them, she reached for the locket, her fingers closing around it for the first time in decades. The cool metal pressed into her palm, grounding her in here and now, even as it pulled her back into the past. It was the first tangible step toward confronting a truth she had buried for far too long, and toward finding the strength to let her family in on the secret that had shaped her life in ways they could never have imagined. The locket felt heavier in her hand than she remembered, its tarnished surface whispering secrets from a time long past. She turned it over slowly, her fingers tracing the intricate filigree that she had once adored. It was as though the locket carried the weight of all the years it had been missing, the dreams, the heartbreaks, the sacrifices. Across the table, Daniel watched her intently, his gaze a mixture of hope and quiet anticipation. "Do you want to open it?" he asked gently, his voice breaking the silence that had enveloped them. She hesitated. The thought of what might be inside filled her with both longing and dread. "I'm not sure," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready for what it might reveal." Daniel nodded, his expression understanding. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." But wasn't there. She couldn't shake the feeling that the past was catching up to her, demanding to be faced. With a deep breath, she pressed the small latch on the locket, and it popped open with a soft click. Inside was a tiny photograph, faded with age but still clear enough to make her heart skip a beat. It was of her and Evelyn, arms wrapped around each other, their smiles radiant and full of life. The image was a frozen moment from a time when their bond had felt unbreakable, untouchable by the harsh realities of the world. She traced the edges of the photo with her thumb, her eyes misting over. "I didn't know this still existed," she whispered, more to herself than to Daniel. "I thought it was lost forever." Daniel leaned forward, his voice quiet. "She kept it all these years," he said. "It was her most treasured possession. She told me it reminded her of a time when she felt truly alive." The words hit her like a wave, and she gripped the locket tightly, as though it might anchor her in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She thought of Evelyn, the vibrant, daring girl who had stolen her heart all those years ago. She thought of the love they had shared, a love that had defied the conventions of their small town, but had ultimately been silenced by the pressures of family and society. And she thought of the life Evelyn must have led after they were forced apart, a life that, despite its hardships, had brought Daniel into the world. "I never stopped thinking about her," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even after she left, even after I tried to move on, she was always with me, in the back of my mind, in my dreams. But I never imagined. I never thought she'd carry a piece of us with her all this time." Daniel's expression softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "I think she wanted you to know," he said. "I think she hoped that someday, somehow you'd find out how much you meant to her." The thought was both comforting and devastating. She had spent so many years believing the chapter of her life was closed, that the love she and Evelyn had shared was something she would carry alone. Now, sitting across from Daniel, she realized that love had never truly been buried. It had lived on in Evelyn, in her memories, and in the life she had created for herself, a life that had ultimately led to this moment. What was she like? She asked suddenly, desperate to know more about the woman Evelyn had become. Daniel smiled, a warmth spreading across his face that reminded her of Evelyn's own radiant expressions. "She was strong," he said, "stronger than I think she realized. She had this quiet determination, this way of facing the world head-on even when things were tough. She loved deeply, but she was also careful with her heart. I think losing you changed her in ways she didn't like to talk about. But she never let it make her bitter. She was kind, and she was brave, and she loved me with everything she had." Tears streamed down her face as she listened, each word painting a picture of the life Evelyn had lived, a life shaped by their love but also by their separation. "I should have looked for her," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have tried harder to stay in touch. Maybe if I had," she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Daniel shook his head gently. "She didn't want you to," he said. "She always said she didn't want to hold you back. She wanted you to have the life you deserved, even if it meant letting go of what you had together." The words were both a balm and a wound, soothing her guilt while deepening her sense of loss. "She was always like that," she said with a bittersweet smile. "Always thinking of others, even when it cost her everything." For a while, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling over them. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the garden was bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I think she wanted us to meet for a reason," he said. "Not just for me to learn about her, but for you to know that her love didn't end when she left. It carried on in me, in the life she built. And maybe, if you're willing, we can keep that connection alive." His words struck a chord deep within her. She had spent so much of her life believing that the past was something to be buried, that the pain of losing Evelyn was something to endure alone. But now, looking at Daniel, she realized that the past and present were not separate. They were threads in the same tapestry, woven together by love, loss, and resilience. "I like that," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall. "I don't know where to begin, but I'd like to try." Daniel smiled, a genuine warmth that seemed to light up the growing darkness around them. "That's all I could ask for," he said. "And I think it's all she would have wanted, too." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, the grandmother felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that the love she had shared with Evelyn, though brief and complicated, had not been in vain. It had lived on in Daniel, in the locket, and now in the bond they were beginning to forge. The days following Daniel's visit were a blur of emotions, each moment pulling her deeper into the labyrinth of her past. The locket never left her side, a constant reminder of Evelyn's love and the unanswered questions that still lingered. She kept it tucked in the pocket of her apron while she tidied the house, on her bedside table at night, and even in her hand when she prayed. It was both a comfort and a challenge, urging her to reconcile with the memories she had locked away for so long. But the present demanded her attention too. She couldn't keep this revelation from her family forever, and the very thought of telling them filled her with dread. How could she explain Evelyn to them? How could she make them understand a love that had flourished in secrecy in a time when acceptance was a rare commodity? And then there was Daniel. How would they react to him? Would they welcome him? Or would his presence unravel the tight-knit family she had spent decades nurturing? The dilemma weighed heavily on her heart, growing heavier with each passing day. On a crisp Saturday morning, as the scent of coffee filled her kitchen and the sunlight streamed through the window, she decided it was time to confront it. Her daughter, the mother of the birthday boy, was coming over with her family for brunch. It would be the perfect opportunity, or the worst possible moment. She couldn't decide which. The morning was filled with the usual chatter and chaos, her grandson chasing the cat, her son-in-law adjusting the temperamental toaster, and her daughter filling her in on the latest neighborhood gossip. For a while, she let herself enjoy the familiar rhythms of family life, clinging to them as a buffer against the storm she was about to unleash. But when the plates were cleared and the coffee cups were refilled, she took a deep breath and addressed her daughter. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. The room grew quiet, her words cutting through the comfortable noise. Her daughter frowned, concern flickering across her face. "What is it, Mom? Is everything okay?" She hesitated, glancing at her grandson, who was now absorbed in a coloring book at the other end of the table. "I've been thinking a lot about the past lately," she said carefully, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "And someone from my past has come back into my life." Her daughter's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? Who?" She reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket, placing it on the table. "Do you remember that man at the birthday party?" "Daniel?" she asked. Her daughter nodded, her expression shifting to one of curiosity. "Yes." "Who was he?" "He seemed different." "He's Evelyn's son," she said, the words feeling heavier than she had anticipated. "Evelyn was someone I loved very much a long time ago." The admission hung in the air, stark and unvarnished. Her daughter blinked, clearly trying to process what she had just heard. "Wait," she said slowly. "Are you saying you and Evelyn?" She nodded, her throat tightening. "We were very close," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But it was a different time. A time when people like us couldn't." Her voice broke, and she looked away, unable to finish the thought. Her daughter sat back in her chair, her expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I was afraid," she said simply. "Afraid of what people would think, of how it might affect our family. And after Evelyn left, it was easier to pretend it never happened." Her daughter's eyes softened, but her voice carried a hint of frustration. "But it did happen, Mom. And now this man, Daniel, is here because of it? What does he want?" "He doesn't want anything," she said quickly. "He just wanted to know more about his mother, and she sent him to me. He's not here to disrupt anything. But his presence made me realize that I've been carrying this secret for too long. It's time to let it out, to let it breathe." Her daughter sighed, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. I need time to process this," she said. "It's a lot, to think about you and Evelyn, and now Daniel. It changes the way I see things." "I know," she said softly, "and I'm sorry if this feels like too much. But I need you to understand that Evelyn was a part of my life, a part of who I am. And Daniel, he's not a stranger. He's family in his own way." The word family seemed to strike a chord with her daughter. She glanced at her son, still engrossed in his coloring, and then back at her mother. "Does he want to meet us?" she asked hesitantly. "I think he does," she admitted. "But only if you're ready. He's not pushing for anything. He's giving us space to decide." The room fell silent again, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, her daughter reached for the locket, turning it over in her hands. "This was hers?" she asked. "It was ours," she said. "She kept it all these years. And now it's brought Daniel to meet us." Her daughter nodded slowly, a tentative smile breaking through the cloud of uncertainty. "I think I'd like to meet him," she said. "But I'll need time." "Take all the time you need," she said, relief flooding through her. "This is a journey, not a race." As they sat together, the weight of the secret began to lift, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope. She knew there would be challenges ahead, conversations, questions, perhaps even conflicts. But she also knew that forgiveness and understanding were possible. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that the ties that bound her family could stretch to include the truths of her past without breaking. The days that followed her conversation with her daughter were a delicate balancing act, a careful weaving of the present and the past. She spent hours replaying the words she had shared, wondering if she had said too much or not enough. Yet, despite her fears, a tentative sense of relief began to take root. The weight of her secret, carried for so many years, no longer pressed as heavily on her shoulders. She had taken the first step toward healing, not just for herself, but for her family as well. Daniel called the following week, his voice steady yet cautious, as though sensing her vulnerability. "I didn't want to push," he said, "but I wanted to see how you're feeling. And if you're ready, I'd like to meet your family." His request was simple, but the implications were profound. She thought of her daughter's hesitant smile, the cautious hope she had seen in her eyes. "They need time," she said carefully. "This is all new to them. But I think they're open to meeting you. I'll arrange something soon." The conversation ended with a mutual understanding, and as she hung up the phone, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. This meeting wouldn't be easy, but it had the potential to bring something she had long thought impossible: closure and connection. The following Sunday, she hosted a small family dinner, inviting her daughter, son-in-law, grandson, and Daniel. She spent the morning preparing, her hands busy with chopping, stirring, and arranging, even as her mind swirled with 1,000 what-ifs. What if they didn't connect? What if old wounds reopened instead of healing? What if her family couldn't accept Daniel, or the parts of her life he represented? By the time the doorbell rang, her nerves were frayed. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Daniel standing there, a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. "For you," he said with a warm smile. "I thought they might brighten the room." She accepted them with a grateful smile, her fingers brushing his briefly as she took the bouquet. "Thank you," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I hope you're ready for a lot of questions." He chuckled softly. I'll do my best." Her daughter arrived shortly after, her husband carrying a casserole dish, and her grandson clutching a brightly colored drawing. "It's a dinosaur," he announced proudly, holding it up for Daniel to see. "I made it today." Daniel knelt to his level, his smile genuine and kind. "That's amazing," he said. "You're a great artist." The ice broke more easily than she had dared to hope. Over dinner, the conversation flowed cautiously at first, like a stream testing its path through unfamiliar terrain. Her daughter asked about Daniel's life, where he grew up, what he did for work, what his mother had been like. Daniel answered each question with a thoughtful sincerity that seemed to put everyone at ease. "She was remarkable," he said of Evelyn, his voice softening. "She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world. She used to say it was a gift she learned from someone she loved deeply." Her daughter glanced at her mother, her expression thoughtful. "It sounds like she was a lot like you," she said, her tone carrying no judgment, only quiet observation. The evening wore on, the initial tension giving way to a tentative warmth. Her grandson, ever curious, peppered Daniel with questions about his favorite dinosaurs and whether he could come to his next birthday party. Her son-in-law shared stories of his own family, bridging the gap with humor and shared humanity. And her daughter, though still guarded, seemed to soften with each passing moment. By the time dessert was served, the grandmother felt something she hadn't expected: peace. She watched her family interact with Daniel, saw the way her daughter's laughter mingled with his, and felt a flicker of hope that this fragile connection might grow into something more enduring. After the dishes were cleared and the goodbyes exchanged, she and Daniel sat together in the quiet living room. The room felt smaller now, cozier, as though the evening had drawn them closer in more ways than one. "Thank you for today," Daniel said, his voice sincere. "It meant more than I can say." She smiled, her hand resting lightly on the locket that now hung around her neck. "It wasn't easy," she admitted, "but it was worth it. I think they see now what I've been starting to see myself, that the past doesn't have to define us, but it can shape us in ways that make us stronger." Daniel nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I think my mother would have been proud of today," he said. "Proud of you, of us?" Her throat tightened, but she managed a smile. "I hope so," she said. "She deserved so much more than what life gave her. But maybe this is a way to honor her, to carry her legacy forward." As the evening wound down, she walked Daniel to the door, her heart lighter than it had been in years. They stood there for a moment, the night air cool against their skin. "You've given me something I didn't think I'd ever have," she said softly. "A chance to heal." Daniel reached out, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "You've given me the same," he said, "and I think we're just getting started." As she watched him walk down the path and disappear into the night, she felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. The wounds of the past hadn't disappeared, but they had begun to heal, stitched together by truth, connection, and the enduring power of love. In the weeks following that pivotal family dinner, the grandmother's life took on a new rhythm, one she hadn't expected at her age. Conversations with Daniel became a regular occurrence, sometimes over the phone and sometimes in person. Each conversation peeled back another layer of the past, allowing her to see not only Evelyn but also herself in a new light. Her family, too, began to open their hearts. Her daughter, initially hesitant, grew curious about the stories Daniel shared and the pieces of her mother's history that had long been hidden. Her grandson, with the unfiltered acceptance only a child could offer, declared Daniel his new favorite uncle. But even as the connections deepened, the grandmother knew there was one final chapter of this journey she had yet to face. It began one quiet evening when Daniel arrived unexpectedly, his expression solemn as he held a small box in his hands. "There's something I want to share with you," he said, stepping inside. "It's something my mother left for you." Her hands trembled as she took the box, its weight feeling far greater than its size. "What is it?" she asked, though a part of her already knew it would hold something profound. Daniel gestured for her to sit, his voice gentle. She wrote you a letter. I think she wanted you to have her words. The box contained a single envelope, aged and fragile, with her name written in Evelyn's familiar handwriting. The sight of it brought tears to her eyes before she even broke the seal. Carefully, she unfolded the letter, her breath catching as Evelyn's words spilled onto the page. My dearest, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer there to say these words in person. But I hope you can feel my voice in them, just as I've felt yours in my heart all these years. There isn't a day that has passed when I haven't thought of you, your kindness, your laughter, the way you made the world feel brighter just by being in it. Our time together was short, far too short, but it shaped me in ways that lasted a lifetime. You gave me the courage to be who I was, even when the world tried to make me feel small. I wanted to find you again to tell you these things myself. But life had other plans, and I could never bring myself to risk the peace you had built. Instead, I poured all my love into my son Daniel, who is my greatest joy. And now, through him, I found a way to reach you. I don't want you to carry guilt for what we lost. What we had was beautiful, even if it couldn't last. And now you have the chance to take that beauty and share it with Daniel, with your family, with yourself. You deserve that, my love. Thank you for being my light in the dark, even when the world felt impossible. I hope you'll carry that light forward, not just for me, but for you. With all my love, always, Evelyn. The grandmother's tears fell freely as she read, her heart breaking and healing all at once. The words were a balm, a bridge, a blessing. They held the weight of everything she and Evelyn had shared, along with the hope of what would come next. Daniel watched her carefully, his own emotions evident in the way he sat quietly, allowing her the space to process. When she finally looked up, her voice was thick with emotion. She was remarkable, she said. I always knew that, but seeing it here in her words, it's overwhelming. She loved you, Daniel said simply. That's something she never stopped telling me. And I think in her own way, she wanted us to love each other too. Not the same way, of course, but as family. The word family struck a chord deep within her. For so long, she had thought of Evelyn as a part of her past, something separate from the life she had built. But now she saw the truth. Evelyn had always been part of her, woven into her very being. And through Daniel, that connection had found its way into the present. In the weeks that followed, the grandmother shared Evelyn's letter with her daughter, who read it with tears streaming down her face. I understand now, she said softly, handing the letter back. You did what you thought was best at the time. And now I think it's time we make room for Daniel. The family began to welcome Daniel in earnest, inviting him to dinners, outings, and celebrations. Slowly but surely, he became a part of their lives, a living reminder of the love and resilience that had brought them all together. And through it all, the grandmother found herself growing too, learning to embrace not only the joys of her present, but also the truths of her past. The real turning point came on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when her grandson approached her with his sketchbook. Grandma, he said, holding up a drawing. This is you, and this is Daniel, and this is Evelyn. I made us all a family. She stared at the picture, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. It's beautiful, she said, pulling him into a hug. You've captured us perfectly. That night, as she sat alone on the patio, the locket warm against her chest, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey had been painful, yes, but it had also been transformative. It had shown her that love, no matter how complicated, how fleeting, or how unconventional, was always worth cherishing. And it had taught her that forgiveness wasn't just about others, it was about forgiving herself too. As the stars blinked into the night sky, she closed her eyes and whispered a silent thank you to Evelyn, to Daniel, and to the life she had been brave enough to embrace. The past and present had finally come together, not as separate chapters, but as a single, beautiful story. And in that moment, she knew that love, in all its forms, was the legacy she would leave behind.